So some prop basics on Dianthus here. So you're talking a liner time anywhere from 5 to as long as 10 weeks in North America. Now, it doesn't mean that you need 10 weeks. It just means that depending on how you're toning, holding, shearing, number of touches that you have in that liner will increase the crop time.
I think that's I think it's a very dynamic liner that you can produce. You can literally take a very fast rooted unpinched liner and move it forward, or you can pinch the liner and bulk that liner. So you can work on getting a lot of development in the liner. It's not a hypersensitive root system like let's say like a pansy plug, where if you root a pansy plug and you get it all jammed up, the pansy never grows. These don't mind storage. They don't mind being a little overgrown. So there is a spread in that crop time, but really, like I said, you could have a unpinched rooted liner probably in 5, but depending on what you do with that liner, you might change the time, and I'm sure Nathan's going to help us figure that out here shortly.
Yes. So recommended sizes would be a 102 or denser. Really, the reason why we're recommending around a 102 and not something maybe with less cells is that you do want to create a high humidity environment around the cutting, right? We want to have a microclimate, so we're not adding moisture over top as frequently, so we can have the porous media dry out to really enhance the rooting in the callus. All right. Your timing for this sort of propagation is you're looking around May or September for your perennials, right? That we want to bulk up and go into fall and then go dormant. Or more of your annuals, we can do around July through really the end of November. Now, I have had a few people get some liners from some of the rooting stations that I visited that have picked up the annualized portion of this Dianthus. Your DGIs, your Lucas, your Massone plants, your Sants. They really have had a lot of later orders, but that's where we're going to be growing them more at moderate temperatures, similar to like an osteo or paracallus, right, Gary? That's what you would.
Exactly. And we have to work through the particulars of the scheduling and maximum hot humid temperature factors. But the bottom line is this is a product that is produced and sold year round in Europe. And I think we can certainly create some season extender opportunities for late spring as well as fall. But what we're going to really probably put the most energy on is where the real opportunity lies, which is the front shoulder, which is really February, March. The idea is produce it with very little energy inputs and then have it out of your greenhouse in time to still make a nice turn for Mother's Day.
From stage 1 to 2, so your callus to your roots coming out, right? We're talking about 8 to 12 days, right? And then your bottom heat's going to be preferred around 68 to 72 or 20 to 22 Celsius until visible roots. Once we get visible roots really coming down off of them, it's not necessarily important that we keep that high bottom heat on it. In fact, when I was over in Essen and we were touring some very large Oscar growers, he would admit that during the rooting out phases is when he would provide the heat, and then he would back off the higher heat during his toning of his liner, or in fact, growing out into his finished container. And again, I would recommend doing a high porous media for this liner. We don't necessarily want that heavy, wet bark type media that's really not going to help with that callus and rapid root formation. Rooting hormones can be used and recommended here. You can do 1,000 ppm liquid dips. You can do, I've seen people do an Advocate or Hortus a KIBA spray at 100 ppm. Now, I will say with the sprays, you will get that twisting, right? The twisting of the leaves after the spray is normal for that, but you will see that relax within 3 to 5 days. NAA does harm the stems at higher rates, and that alcohol-based hormone there, can lead to induce some fusarium at that bottom of the stem, right? And that's really one of the issues that comes up in propagation and also later in finish, right? We're going to make sure that bottom of the stem and that base is nice and happy and isn't drowned out, nor is it really attacked by a lot of chemical applications. It is recommended from our friends that we kind of avoid powders on this, although I know some of you will do it, and that's fine. but just be aware that we want to make sure that we're rehydrating properly after applying the powder, because we don't get a situation where the powder is actually taking the moisture from that base of the stem on that cutting after we stick it.
Yeah, if you're going to use powder, just barely dip the bottom. You don't want to get it up the stem, because like I said, it kind of, once it gets wet, it just turns into a paste and it just becomes an oxygen barrier. And you want that air around that base and the callus to get those roots out of the callus.
So as I mentioned, we do have a tendency to overmist Dianthus, right? And look, it's very common between stages 1 to 2 when we have callus, and the problem gets further complicated when we have some URCs rooting out and then other ones are not. Again, if you see that situation, it's where in the future I would use and develop a rooting hormone strategy to increase the evenness on these plants. But the reason why really is, if you're doing summer production, you will have to have some sort of shade. That way we can lessen the irrigation vents in the middle of the day when it's really, frightful and hot. Because if we start getting a overly saturated media, we're going to delay. We could create an environment that's really healthy for fungus gnats to chew at the base of the stem with the larvae. It's just something we want to be very cognizant of, right? And
James, it's like a balancing act, because the reality is these are stored cuttings, and you want to be able to retain as much moisture in that stored cutting, and they've seemed to do a pretty good job with that. But the major reason why you have some that don't root and then ultimately fall out is the cuttings are desiccated. So what you tend to do is you tend to miss the beans out of it for the first 3 days or so to rehydrate any ones that are dry, and that's where the dipping might help. But then you got to recognize that now that you've hydrated those cuttings, you need to go back to a more of a dry propagation mindset and more oxygen around the base. I think that's one of the paramount things is historically with domestic supply, you need to miss the beans out of them for a few days, but then you got to realize you got to back off pretty quickly. Otherwise they get saturated. You get that we call lump callus and no roots. You get a nice big fat lump callus at the base of the cutting and no roots.
We've had great success here in West Chicago with a fog nozzle, small droplet size, and or combination with remay over the top, keeping the water off the cuttings and just holding the humidity in the air has worked great for us.
One of the things that I stumbled across, and a shout out to Jim Stepp at VWI, who kind of figured out how to do this, and it's brilliant, and that is you mount the 4-way dram fog nozzle, Netafim fog nozzle, excuse me, onto a boom. And now instead of that fan pushing water down, it's just putting moisture in the air, and about half of it evaporates before it gets to the soil, and then it allows you to keep the humidity up without a lot of free water. It's been a huge boom in direct sticking and poinsettias, and I think it's an excellent thing to look at when you have something like a Dianthus that is prone to overmisting. Sorry, James, didn't mean to.
No, not at all. Guys, please add in, because Nathan has that practical knowledge from what we're doing at West Chicago in the field offices. And honestly, Gary, you and I hardly ever get to spend any time together. You pretty much have the western part of the country. So I have the eastern part of North America. And we just don't get to go to the same growers all the time. And really, there's a lot of good information in solving very similar issues from many growers.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of ways to skin that cat.
Yeah.
Sure. All right. So continuing on.
Yeah. So talking about lights. All right. That's been a hot button topic. Really shouldn't be. But we're illuminating a lot more of our crops. Right. And when we say that we're backing up a schedule, and this is something that we can propagate in early fall, or say we're doing an annualized schedule and we're propagating in somewhere in November and December, well, and especially if we're in a northern climate, that's where I highly recommend that we have some sort of supplemental lighting, right? It doesn't have to be LEDs. It's just what provides the most moles. And I do see somebody mentioning about putting remay and prop to keep off, and keep everything rehydrated. We actually eliminated that slide, but that is a good point. That is a good way of keeping that moisture around the cutting, but not necessarily getting that media saturated with mist. But going back to the lighting strategy here, It is a facultative long day plant, and long days are not required for flowering. But if we do provide long days, it will hasten the time that flowers come on. All right. So in northern climates, if you're just doing it for spring and you're in propagation, hey, you don't need to do extension. You just need to provide some supplemental moles with whatever lights that you have. But if, say, you're in a deep southern climate where you have that shoulder business hits really early, yeah, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to provide a little bit more extra moles and calories so you can get that flower flush a little bit quicker and hit that shoulder market with that milder climate where you can, get it into the landscape or get it out into containers where they can take that little bit of frost or even a freeze as long as it's not a prolonged period of time.
I think one thing to keep in mind, if you are doing, we'll talk about these different growing regimes, if you're doing a long perennial style production where you're propagating in the summer, you probably don't need lights in prop when you're sticking in July. But when you're trying to build that plant, when you're doing a faster crop coming around the corner, one of the keys that you have to do if you want to try to hit an early spring market is to get enough body on that plant while you still have some energy in September, October, before they kind of, you start to run out of light. And so that's where supplemental lighting in sort of the bulking phase, and then also we'll talk about it later in the finishing phase as well. So yeah, definitely can be a nice tool to help you hit your dates.
So talking about liners and PGRs, here you're talking about a dayside or a cyclocell or lower rates combined together would be acceptable. But this is one of the crops that I do have to call out that we do have a bonsai spray, a light spray at a 1 to 2 parts utilized in the liner. And then Nathan's going to hit in much more detail here about configured to use to branching with maybe a recommended rate of 400 to 600 ppm, but this is variety specific. So again, in your operation, depending on the many varieties from selected that you're choosing, I would recommend that you do some trials before utilizing it widespread. And then we are utilizing a little bit more of the opportunity of adding some GA to stretch up the floral bud to see if we can't mechanize, because one of the things that I will tell you about and be completely honest is as we're building this over a cooler period into finish, you will get the earlier flower and the earlier flush that you can just simply roll out and pluck, but they do last a very long time. So as you get closer, you're about 4 to 5 weeks away from shipping. It's less important to debud or deflower anything, right? And then
go ahead, James.
Oh, and I was going on nutrition. So if you're going to hit on the floor,
I was just going to comment on the GA thing, and literally we've worked with a grower that's been playing around with it, and we saw benefits on 2 fronts. One, in the early stage when you're trying to bulk enough body to literally fill the pot with foliage to get, and so GA will expand those shoots. And I don't think it makes more shoots, that's the configure's job, but it'll definitely elongate those shoots and get some bulk in the body of the pot. Then we also saw an application when you have buds up, and to get those buds to flash open, you can do it like we can do with many other species, where we can pop that flower with the GA. I think it's preliminary work. It's very exciting work because it shows that we can use these tools to branch and to bulk and to hasten the flower, because that overcomes, that is what is probably the biggest challenge in this crop, is getting the schedule just right, especially if you want to hit holidays. So these are great tools. It's super exciting where we're going to go with the research on that.
And then one of my colleagues in the South has brought up a point just to expand on when I mentioned as far as lighting is concerned. I would say that, look, supplemental lighting, and the further south you go, say you're propagating in August or September, supplemental lighting is not required. But if you're trying to hit something and you're in the deep south region, you're trying to actually get a finished crop, full and flower, sometime December or January to go into the landscape and out into the world, that's when I would not use lighting in propagation, but I would use lighting in my finish. Right. And that's when I would add the additional calories. That way I can get much more of a bud set to really hit that early season. Because, you're just going to have less light still naturally going into that growth phase of that October through November period. So having some supplemental there can be helpful, so you don't have to back up your schedule so much. But going back to nutrition here, we have, when you see pre-roots go 75 to 100 ppm as a drench. And then, of course, like I mentioned, we have reduced light levels, right? Going into fall, if you're doing normal season production. Normal season, I would say, would be targeting months of maybe even a March, depending on how mild your climate is, or all the way into, a later May. But in that earlier March, and if we're trying to force in February and January, just be cognizant that we should bump up our nutrition, whether we're talking about, liner stage or even in the early finish stage, because we're going to irrigate less frequently. And that's where I see a little bit of jam up out in the marketplace, out at growers, is, hey, we're not irrigating as much, but we're still irrigating like 100 to maybe 125. And we're just on the border of needing a little bit more nutrition because we're not irrigating as frequently. My particular favorite would be a 17-5-17 or another calcium nitrate based fertilizer, something with low phosphorus. But really, we just don't need that phosphorus at higher rates because we don't necessarily need that elongation stretch. So your pests and diseases, especially in prop here, your number one target, like many species, is going to be your fungus gnats, particularly your larvae stage. And then alternaria, really, depending on when you're propagating, could be an issue if you're doing late spring or you're doing through your fall. But that's generally tackled by a lot of broad spectrum fungicides. And then, as we mentioned before, there's a lot of things that there's a few things, right, in managing your moisture and also what you choose to use as hormones that can actually help you with the Fusarium issue on the URCs, right? And you just don't want to provide an opportunity for injury for the disease to enter.
Typically we don't see a lot of Fusarium on it in greenhouse settings, but on perennial production, outdoor production, and tunnel production, where there's a lot of other species around and the conditions are a little bit more stressful, you can run into that. And I think alternaria in the same situation. You see it flare up when they're in drippy tunnels. But again, the Fusarium, you really kind of you control it culturally. The alternaria is super easy. Just a nice broad spectrum preventative spray will work wonders.
Holding and toning liners here. So again, we touched this a little bit earlier, just the opportunity to really hold and tone liners. Look, rooted liners should be toned, right, with temperature primarily. Basically, how we get that accomplished is we reduce 5 to 7 degrees or 3 to 4 degrees Celsius every 2 to 3 days until we get to about 50 to 55. And then we can actually, so while that happens, just be cognizant of, hey, they're going to transpire less. Let's not continue with the same amount of irrigations and frequency that we were doing previously, because that's how we get to an oversaturated liner, right? But the advantage is here, tone liners can be directly transplanted into protected areas in fall. Like, we don't necessarily need it in our best greenhouse space in the fall, right? Or in spring, we can go into those minimally heated greenhouses that have our ranunculus, our pansies, our osteos, something that's a low energy crop, but we're still heating to about 45, 48 at the lowest at the night, right? Now, properly toned liners, I would say we can hold for about 4 weeks. Believe it or not, the pictures there are much longer than 4 weeks on that slide. And they've had a couple more shears, but that's really speaks to the flexibility that a liner has, right? And when we're holding and toning our liners, we can plan our labor around when we're going to transplant, or, hey, I got to get these mums out, then I have time to transplant my crop, right? Or conversely, I have my poinsettias going out over the next 3 weeks. Well, we can hold these and transplant them after if we need to. We also can then create, staging of our crops through one stick week as opposed to multiple sticks like we do with many other crops in the annualized world. We do have a question here on why low phosphorus. Hey, that's just really my, that's what I really like to do as far as feeding is concerned. We don't need a high phosphorus on this because it's not a crop that we really want to stretch up and stretch between the internodes. There's a lot of nodes that'll come out on normal growth with this. But yeah, it's especially in propagation. I really like to stay away from having a high phosphorus feed as being my base feed that I use routinely.
Well, the other thing just to keep in mind, just general floriculture practices, you don't want a high ammoniacal nitrogen, high phosphorus feed in cold growing conditions. And we are talking about growing these things is, you know, always cool at the very least, or downright cold. And you don't want that in those cold conditions. So you want to stick to a lower phosphorus, more nitrate based feed regime.